Hello and welcome to Pedagogy in Practice. This official Old Dominion University podcast is jointly produced by the ODU Center for Faculty Development and the University Libraries. I'm your co-host, Tim Heckman, and I'm the Dean of Libraries here at ODU.
And I'm your co-host, Crystal Kinlock-Taylor, Educational Program Developer with the Center for Faculty Development. The purpose of this podcast is to highlight talented educators and innovative teaching practices among ODU faculty to create an engaged community of practice. With that in mind, we'd like to start with a quick disclaimer. The opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the co-hosts and our guests, and not of Old Dominion University.
All right. Thanks, Crystal. So our guest today is Lucy Wittkower. Lucy is the head of Libraries, Education, and Assessment here at Old Dominion University, a role she's held since 2017. In that role, she oversees the ODU Library's extensive undergraduate instruction program, as well as our library-wide assessment efforts. She's also a PhD student in educational psychology and program evaluation at ODU and an adjunct instructor teaching information literacy courses for ODU's library science and cybersecurity programs, as well as assessment in libraries for ODU's MLIS program. So Lucy keeps pretty busy. So prior to becoming an academic librarian, Lucy spent a decade teaching music in public schools. So she brings a really rare combination of experience and skills to her role here at ODU. Hi, Lucy, and welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you.
Yes. So let's get started. So first, who or what most shaped your approach to teaching and working with students?
Okay, that's a really good question. I've been in education in some capacity almost all of my life as either a student or an educator. So I think there have been a lot of experience that have shaped my approach to teaching and working with students, both good and bad. But when I think about the good teachers that have shaped my approach, I mostly think about the teachers that I worked with during my first few years as a new teacher in public schools. And one person that really influenced me was the high school choir director that my middle school fed into. And we worked together for 5 or 6 years. And I think that the most important thing that he modeled for me was relationship building and letting the kids have fun, getting to know the kids before moving into teaching of skills and knowledge. And it was a really effective approach, especially with young teenagers. And it wasn't my approach. When I first started teaching, I was really focused on having a plan and sticking to the plan, which doesn't really always work when you're working with middle schoolers. I learned pretty quickly. And he just didn't really worry that the kids wouldn't get a concept or meet a goal. He knew they would and could. So he helped me to find balance and flexibility in that. And he also understood and valued the importance of the process of learning without constantly focusing on the end product, which is relatively short term in the grand scheme of things. He really modeled the importance of taking the time to know who your students are, being aware of all the things that they're bringing in with them when they show up in your classroom. And so when I first started teaching, I was just happy to be a teacher and have a job. And I didn't really think about some of the complexities of the community and how important it was for that to be a part of the approach to teaching. And luckily, I met him very early on in my career.
That's great. Sounds like a really fabulous mentor, and a good approach, I think, has helped you to keep some balance as you have moved along in your career. So moving on to our next question, what are some techniques or strategies that you use to create an inclusive classroom environment that supports diverse learning needs?
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our teaching in the library, which is what we call one-shots. We see classes maybe 1 or 2 times as they're working on a research project. So creating that inclusive environment can sometimes be difficult because you're not with them very long, but you want students to feel comfortable in the library and feel comfortable asking questions and that sort of thing. So I try to do things in class that set that tone pretty immediately. I try to practice critical pedagogy in my teaching, which ties in the lived experiences of students to the content and acknowledges the inequalities that exist in our classrooms and in our societies and in the content that we teach and how that impacts learning. Like I said, it's difficult to do in a really short period of time, but some of the small things that I try to do to be inclusive are really simple, like standing at the door when students enter, or at least saying hi when they come in and not just standing off and setting up my stuff while they're sitting down to show that I see them as individuals and not just like, okay, you're here. Now I'm going to talk to this blob of people for an hour. Or I always write my name and pronouns on the board, which seems really small, but students, it's really important to students. And just telling students my name and pronouns at the beginning of class. I make sure that I tell students where the restrooms are, especially at the beginning of class or the beginning of the semester when a lot of students are visiting the library for the first time. In our classroom, we've played around with different seating to try to break down some of the like physical power dynamics that exist in classrooms, but we do have flexible furniture. We haven't really had a whole lot of success in that because we rely on our screen to show them things. But we do try to do a lot of group work and that sort of thing. A lot of what we teach, another thing that I do to try to be inclusive is a lot of what we teach are search strategy skills. And so we have to use like topic examples. And I try to use examples that I think the students will relate to and not select something that will make some students feel bad or alienated. Like pros and cons topics can sometimes do this. So I try to stay away from those if I can. So that's one way in library instruction. And then for inclusivity. And then diverse learning needs, if I use slides, I make sure that they're accessible. I don't have a lot of hard to read colors and fonts and things like that. I've been to a number of workshops on that here at ODU, and they've been really useful. I also try to avoid cognitive overload because it's so tempting to give students so much information when they come to the library because we only see them the one time, but that is not effective for most of our students. So we've worked really hard to scaffold our instruction across several classes that are part of the core curriculum. So students aren't receiving too much information at one time. If I give students a handout or a worksheet to complete, I always tell them they don't have to finish it in class because students work at different paces and the classes are so short. They may not have time to process and do the activities in 50 or 75 minutes. And then in terms of accessibility, we do ask faculty before sessions if any of their students need physical accommodations, and we set those up ahead of time if needed. And then I think going back to kind of that being in the moment with students, I try to really be alert and aware of how students are responding and what they're doing and just adapt to what I'm seeing. So if students look lost or I can see on their laptop screens that they're not with me, I adapt my pacing to meet those learning needs. Since I don't know the students in advance, I think flexibility is really important when it comes to accommodating student needs. And then I think the last thing that I do to support diverse learning needs is I try to have at least 2 or 3 different types of activities during a session. So some students love group work and some hate it. So I might have like 10 minutes of group work, but also have something that they can do independently, have a mix of lecture and hands-on activity to support the different learning preferences, and also just to support the content and what is needed for teaching that content.
Do you have a particular assignment or classroom activity that you really enjoy doing with students? And can you tell us about it and how students respond to it?
Sure. So I really like teaching students about source evaluation and talking about misinformation and disinformation and that sort of stuff. So one lesson that I'm really enjoying right now is one that I created for my 3-credit information literacy course for cybersecurity. It's an asynchronous course. So the biggest challenge is just getting students to actually do the readings and videos before they just skip over to the assignment and start trying to do the assignment. So I like this lesson because of the content and because I'm trying a new tool. So we have a module on algorithms, and it focuses on algorithmic bias and its impact on historically marginalized communities and how that connects to the spread of misinformation and disinformation and who's impacted most by this. And I use a tool called Perusall, which I actually learned about at the QEP workshop from Beth Vincelet, and it loads the reading, the PDF or the video into the perusal page. And you can have students comment and discuss throughout either the reading. They can highlight a sentence or maybe a word that they don't understand or those sorts of things. And so they can discuss with their classmates and with me the content that they're reading or watching. It also tells me if they read or watch the whole thing, which may sound kind of creepy, but I find that it gets students to engage with the materials when maybe they otherwise may not have read the whole thing. And then they wouldn't learn about algorithmic bias, which I think everyone needs to learn about. So that lesson is working pretty well. So they watch a video and they listen to a podcast with Sophia Noble, where she talks about her previous work with algorithms of oppression, but she brings in more current things like ChatGPT and AI tools. So they're really interested in that. And then they do another reading, and all of that's in perusal. And then they have an assignment, kind of a reflective assignment. The student response to this, I actually just tried it last semester, and they did really well with it. And in the reflections, some of them talked about how they didn't know about these things before, and they were mad about it. Some of them had kind of noticed it in their lives, but didn't know all of the details behind it. So they did a really good job with personal reflection. And then they also think about how it might inform their work in cybersecurity. So I think it's a module that they like. It's definitely one that I like a lot.
That sounds really cool, actually. That sounds like a fascinating assignment. I feel like I would enjoy that as well. The university's QEP about, critical reading and thought is, I think, super valuable for framing some of those activities.
I did the QEP workshop last summer, and I learned a lot of strategies for getting students to read, which really applies to teaching students about source evaluation. So it was really good.
I guess we should probably define our terms, right? The QEP is ODU's quality enhancement plan, which is part of the accreditation process. All right, moving along. So how do you adapt your teaching strategies when you transition between online and in-person formats? Are there any key differences in your approach, things that you found work particularly well, that sort of thing?
Yeah, definitely. So with the asynchronous classes that I teach as an adjunct, with undergraduates, I've found that kind of just plopping things into a module and having them read it on their own or watch videos on their own doesn't really work in terms of their learning. So all of the assignments within the modules are designed to have them engage with the materials in the course. So they have small assignments that relate to a reading or video or an activity so that they are kind of learning how to engage with those course materials. So the assignment isn't really a big end product. It's helping them work through the material. So that's what I do with my asynchronous courses. And I think it's been working pretty well. My graduate courses are a little bit different, and they don't have as many small assignments, but we also meet weekly for office hours, which are pretty robust, and we can kind of talk about things there. As far as like teaching online live, I think that online classes need to be a bit more structured than in-person classes in terms of how engagement is planned out. And I find that people in online classes get bored with the same sorts of things. So if you're teaching on Zoom, like breakout rooms and polling, people are tired of those. So I think if you're going to use those, it needs to be really clear what the purpose is and what the expectations are in terms of engagement and why you're doing it. So if you send people to breakout rooms, what are they going to be doing there? And what do they need to be ready to talk about when they come back? When I'm doing library instruction online, I often don't know what the student engagement is going to be like until I just quickly get a feel for it at the beginning of class. So if everybody in the class has their cameras off and they don't talk, there's not really that much I can do about it, having, just being there the one time. It feels different than if they have their cameras on and they are talking. So if I end up with a class that's really quiet on Zoom and they don't talk very much, I will ask them questions and encourage them to type in the chat. You could ask them like, how comfortable are you with this database, and type your answer in the chat, that sort of thing. Or I use activities that don't require them to talk or turn their camera on. So for example, I have an activity that I learned about from a colleague at William & Mary called a waterfall, where they will think of an answer or look for an answer, but they wait until the instructor tells them to put it in the chat. So everybody puts their responses in at the same time. And then they're interested in seeing what other people said, and they're not all saying the same things. So little things like that can help with engagement in online classes. In an in-person class, if students aren't really participating or talking much, I may have them talk to a partner at their table or hold up a true-false card or something like that. If I'm going to have the students use some type of technology, it needs to have a really low learning curve so that the focus is on the content and not how to use the thing. I used to use Google Jamboards a lot, which I think maybe they're going away. And Padlet is similar. I use those for brainstorming and having notes to refer back to later, or just kind of having a live visual of what people are thinking. And it's also really easy to use. Anybody can click on the link and kind of quickly figure out how to use it. But I never use that with in-person classes, because we could do the same thing using like Post-it notes or a whiteboard where they're more physically getting up and doing something. So, and you can take pictures and save notes if you need to. So I think the approaches are somewhat similar in both venues, but like I said, online classes need a bit more planning in terms of how to facilitate that engagement, making connections, because you may or may not be able to see if people are responding like you can in an in-person class. Things still happen, of course, it's not always perfect, but I try to plan that stuff out in advance.
Lucy, these are great tips for both online synchronous and asynchronous courses, as well as your in-person. So thank you so much for sharing. Definitely wrote that down, the waterfall activity, and thinking about how to incorporate that into future courses. So thank you for that. And kind of our last structured question, how do you stay up to date on the latest teaching strategies and tools? And can you recommend any resources that have helped you along your teaching journey?
Yeah, so I think in terms of staying up to date for day-to-day engagement, I'm really busy, so I gravitate towards kind of like bite-sized tools and readings, and then I might like process it, like I might remember it like a couple months later and go back to it like, oh yeah, that was a cool thing that I need to look at. But I try to take advantage of the workshops that are being offered here, Center for Faculty Development. We mentioned the QEP workshops earlier. Those are always great. There are a lot of great webinars and conferences out there on topics that I'm interested in. Like we have this organization called ASERL, which is Association of Southeastern Research Libraries. They do a lot of webinars. So I try to attend things as I can, both library related, but also just higher ed related in general. My professional development lately has been more focused on management and assessment, but I also try to engage with teaching stuff as well. And there's a local annual conference that I go to called the Innovative Library Classroom, where I always pick up something new. For resources that have helped me in my journey, my more like theoretical kind of deep reading anchors are Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress. And
Love that book.
Yeah, 1994, but I still I listen to it on audiobook like every 2 years or something, because it's just it's just so good and kind of foundational. And then I also gravitate towards Ferry's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And that one's like a little bit more dense, but I end up like reading it maybe once every 3 years or so. And I kind of think about it a lot. And a current person that I always read is Michael Caulfield. Anything that he publishes about teaching students about source evaluation or misinformation and those sorts of things, I always learn something new from the things that he puts out that I can apply to my own teaching in information literacy. So, but most of my reading right now is for class.
This has been great. So those were our serious scholarly pedagogical questions. We would like to do a little something to understand you a little bit better and what you're into, and just as a kind of fun way to wrap up the episode. So we're going to ask them pretty quickly. You don't have to think about your answers too much. Are you ready? All right. So what was the last book you read or listened to, and would you recommend it?
During the break, I did just some really light, kind of fun reading. And I read this book called The Housemaid, and there was a second one that went with it. And it was just this kind of like thriller thing. So yeah, it was really good. Really quick read, fun.
How do you unwind after a long day? You have like 8 jobs, so I don't know where you unwind.
I sit down every day in the evenings. My husband and I try to like watch a show together on Netflix or something. I just like sit down and have a glass of wine and watch something mindless on TV. That's how I unwind at the end of the day.
That sounds pretty good. Last one. What do you like best about your role and your work as an educator?
I really like how it's kind of evolved over time, and I've always been able to work on things that I'm interested in and excited about. I think that's one of the nice things about working in a library is that you're not doing the same thing all the time, but my job involves like some teaching, some kind of independent work with committees. So I really like the variety in that.
Well, thank you, Lucy. You did an extraordinary job. It was great getting to know you about your teaching practices and about your prior experience as a music teacher. Did not know that about you. So thank you so much. Thank you, listeners, for joining us today for the Pedagogy and Practice podcast, an official podcast of Old Dominion University, the Center for Faculty Development, and ODU Libraries. Your co-hosts again are Tim Hackman and myself, Crystal Kinlock-Taylor. Original music for our theme song is composed and copyrighted by Richard Siegwald. Find and follow our podcast on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you download your favorite podcasts. And visit the ODU Faculty Development website for more information about the show and Old Dominion University. Again, thank you for listening.